The Dean of the John F. Kennedy School of Government, and it's my pleasure to welcome all of you this evening to this event, which is co-sponsored by the Institute of Politics here at the school. The Kennedy School enjoys the good fortune of welcoming each year to this ARCO forum leaders from the worlds of business, from public affairs, and scholarship. We plan each of these events well in advance and very carefully. Now, when tonight's event was first contemplated, none of us imagined that it would take place in the context of the dramatic Middle East peace accords symbolized by the Rabin-Arafat handshake of just 3 weeks ago. Tonight's speaker, the Israeli ambassador to the United States, the Honorable Itamar Rabinovich, played a crucial role in achieving this previously unthinkable breakthrough. Now, in addition to holding the ambassadorship since February of this year, our speaker has served as head of the Israeli delegation for the peace talks with Syria for over a year, and he continues to do so. Ambassador Rabinovich was trained as, and continues to be, a scholar. He holds a bachelor's degree from Hebrew University, a master's degree from Tel Aviv University, and a PhD in Middle Eastern history from the University of California at Los Angeles. Indeed, he is among the foremost scholars, foremost experts on Syria. After 6 years of service with the Israeli Defense Forces, he rose through the ranks at Tel Aviv University, having been a professor of Middle Eastern Studies, director of the Dayan Center for Middle Eastern Studies, dean of humanities, and rector of the university. An accomplished author, Ambassador Rabinovich's 1991 book on early Arab-Israeli negotiations, called The Road Not Taken, received the Jewish Book Award. While the ambassador borrowed the title of that book from our Robert Frost, the Jerusalem Post mentioned another of Frost's verses when this book's intricate revelations of peacemaking called to mind. They quote from Frost was, "We dance around in a circle and suppose, but the secret sits in the middle, and it knows," close quote. The Post Review went on to note that Ambassador Rabinovich's book, quote, "contributes a great deal to exposing the secret," close quote. That is, the secret of peacemaking. Tonight's speaker has contributed to peacemaking not only through his writings, but also through his actions. He can take great pride in his contributions to the recent developments involving Israel, the Palestinians, and Jordan, as well as his continuing efforts towards furthering peace with Syria. Indeed, his job has been made all the more difficult by the divisiveness of these issues within Israel and among the communities that support Israel. With regard to the recent set of breakthroughs, he has cautioned that, quote, "it's too complex for euphoria," close quote. Despite the enormity of the challenges he and his country face, Ambassador Rabinovich remains optimistic and fully committed to achieving and maintaining enduring peace in the region. I know that we are all eager to hear from this distinguished scholar, soldier, and peacemaker. Please join me in welcoming the Israeli ambassador to the United States of America, the Honorable Itamar Rabinovich.
Thank you, Dean, for a very generous introduction, as well as for pronouncing my name right. Before I address the issues, I'd like to begin with a story from my academic past, which is relevant to our pursuit tonight in more ways than one. It has to do with Syria and the Syrian politics, and with predictions, since I trust that as we move into discussion, many of the questions will focus on predictions for the future. I'd like to forewarn you right now. And it's a true story that happened to a British diplomat in Damascus in early 1954. In the British diplomatic system, the ambassador, head of any given station, writes a quarterly report every 3 months in which he or she sum up the events of the quarter, and then ends with a predictive paragraph about what is to be expected in that particular station. And in January 1954, the British ambassador in Damascus was writing the quarterly report for the final 3 months of 1953, and when he reached the predictive paragraph, he looked at the prospects of the then military dictator of Syria, a man called Adib Shishakli, and he took a very, very sanguine view of Shishakli and his prospects, and therefore he ended his predictive paragraph by stating that unless he commits suicide, Shishakli is here to stay. This was January 54. In early February 54, Shishakli was deposed by a military coup, and everybody in London was holding their breath for the first telegram to come out of Damascus. It came, and it became a classic because it opened with the following sentence: "A close scrutiny of the events that have unfolded in Damascus during the past 48 hours inevitably would lead one to the conclusion that Shishakli committed a political suicide." In any event, what I would like to do in the presentation part of this evening is to address 3 issues. I'd like to look at several perspectives from which the September 13th accord between us and the Palestinians can be seen. I'd like to look at the Syria first, Palestine first question of the relationship between the tracks in the period that led to the signing of the accord and to the period that lies ahead of us, and then look at some greater detail in some of the aspects of the current situation of the peace process of the negotiations. Let me begin by the perspectives, and let me suggest that there are 3 perspectives from which the accord of September 13 can be seen. One is a 2-year perspective, the perspective of the Madrid process. We are now in the midst of a peace process. Was begun in October 91 by the Bush-Baker administration in Madrid, and Madrid is not just a name of a capital city, it designates a set of rules that we call the Madrid Framework. They determine that there will be 4 tracks of bilateral negotiations between Israel, Syria, the Palestinians, Jordanians, and the Lebanese, and 5 working groups in which multilateral issues would be discussed, mostly of an economic nature, define the roles of the 2 co-sponsors, the United States and Russia, and so forth and so forth. And the Madrid formula, the Madrid process, represent in the history of the Arab-Israeli conflict the first sustained effort to find a comprehensive solution to the Arab-Israeli conflict. Sustained. There were earlier attempts. There was the Lausanne Conference in 1949, there was the Geneva Conference in 1973, and there were a variety of mediation efforts, but never before has a sustained effort, and we are now looking at 2 years and considerable efforts invested by the co-sponsors, primarily by the United States and some of the participants, in finding a comprehensive solution to the Arab-Israeli conflict. Earlier instances, the Kissinger period, the Carter period, the Egyptian-Israeli peace, have addressed isolated or separate parts, distinct parts of the larger complex of the Arab-Israeli conflict, and have treated some of them, in some cases very successfully, but it had been assumed all along that this conflict was too difficult, too intractable, to try to find a comprehensive solution to. But in the circumstances obtaining in the world and in the Middle East in 1991, the end of the Cold War, the collapse of the Soviet Union, and the American victory in the Gulf, it was felt by the Bush-Baker administration that the time was ripe to seek a comprehensive solution, and they indeed took advantage of their unprecedented position and prestige in order to put the Madrid Framework in place. Now, the only trouble with the Madrid Framework between October 91 and late August, September 1993, was that it failed to produce any tangible result. It produced some progress, but not a breakthrough, not a result. And in this respect, it was very important that finally we had a breakthrough, this Israeli-Palestinian agreement that I think from that point on is going to color and affect the whole Madrid process. This is one perspective. The other perspective is that of 1967, the Israeli military victory in the Six-Day War that produced, paradoxically, both the problem of the territories, but also the resources, the ability to finally address the Arab-Israeli conflict. If we look at some of the efforts that I mentioned earlier to resolve the Arab-Israeli conflict between 1949 and 1967, we would find that the main problem was that Israel had no assets or no bargaining chips to use in the negotiations or in the bargain. The Arab point of departure was that there was a terrible wrong done to the Arabs, that Palestine was an Arab country, that Israel was implanted in the middle of the Arab world. The Arabs were humiliated, and if the Arabs are to accept Israel, then something has to be given to them to redress their honor, prestige, rights, and so forth. And within the Israel of pre-June 4, 1967, there were no assets, there were no chips to bargain with and use in order to placate the Arabs and to make this a feasible arrangement. These assets were produced by 1967. Israel captured the Sinai, the Golan Heights, the West Bank and Gaza, immense territories, and it became the Israeli position and the US position that this time in 1967, unlike 1956, these new possessions should be used in order to obtain for Israel a genuine peace. It was the position, it was not translated into policy until 1977, a decade earlier, when Sadat came to Jerusalem, and the Sinai was used in order to obtain peace between Israel and Egypt. And that was a very important breakthrough. But it remained a solitary breakthrough. And from that point of view, the September 13 agreement between Israel and the Palestinians, or Israel in the PLO, is a second agreement because it's an agreement that bought Israel recognition from a second Arab party. The Palestinians, in this respect, come second after Egypt in having accepted, recognized Israel and its legitimacy. And this is the second time that we used the possessions, the assets obtained in 1967 to this end. In a different situation, we are not looking at trading territory for peace in this instance, but in essence, this is what has happened. Recognition by the Palestinians, in many respects, is even more meaningful than recognition by Egypt in the following way. Egypt was and is the most important Arab states. The fact that Egypt and Israel made peace, the fact that there was no and there is no danger of war between Egypt and Israel has become a cardinal fact in Israel's life, Egypt's life, and the life of the region. But Egypt did not possess the political power to give Israel legitimacy in the Middle East. The Palestinians are in a different position because they have been defined by the other Arabs and by many observers of the Middle Eastern scene as the core of the problem, the core issue of the problem. And as the guardians, the custodians of the core issue, the Palestinians are in a position to give us the recognition, the acceptance that Egypt alone could not give us. And from that point of view, the recognition extended to Israel by the PLO on the eve of September 13 and on September 13 will resonate in a very powerful way in the Middle East. Which takes me to the third perspective, and that is a 100 years perspective. And it's a curious and significant fact that since the beginning of the Arab-Israeli conflict, that was then called the Arab-Jewish conflict in Palestine, you could place it or date it 1917, the Balfour Declaration, or even earlier, when the first Zionists arrived in Palestine, in Ottoman Palestine, in the late 19th century and began what we call the Zionist enterprise in Palestine. A conflict began to brew between them and the Arab inhabitants, who then were not called Palestinians, were called Arabs in that piece of land. Since that time, and we are looking at least at a century now, not a single Palestinian leader, not a single Palestinian group ever made a single agreement, a single deal with the Jewish Zionist Israeli side. There's not a single leader who had the courage, the will, or the authority to do that, or a group that could do that. And now, for the first time, this was done by Yasser Arafat and by the PLO, the organization that is largely recognized in the Arab world as the representative of the Palestinian people. And that, of course, is a very telling fact with important ramifications for the continuation of the peace process. Because it is our feeling, and it is also going to be our policy, that since this was done by the Palestinians and other Arab states, be they in the Gulf, be they in North Africa, who have no border with us, who have no direct quarrel with us, who have been telling us for years that they participate in this conflict because they owe solidarity to the Palestinians, can now normalize relations with us. It was therefore that the Prime Minister, immediately after signing on September 13th, proceeded to Morocco in order to demonstrate that we were bent on further normalization. And it was therefore very important that last Friday there was a second handshake with the Crown Prince of Jordan that indicates that we are determined to continue in the same vein. It's very important to us to obtain more normalization, more recognition in the Arab and Muslim world, both for its own intrinsic sake and for the sake of bringing to the people in Israel some tangible, concrete proofs that there are dividends to peacemaking that would reinforce us in our feeling that we want to continue in this process. Now there are those who, in the Arab world, who object to this, who say that it's too early, that the Palestinians, Arafat, really did not have the authority to act as they did. And the loudest voice in that small chorus of disapproval is that of Syria, which takes me to my second point, namely the relationship of the two tracks, the Syrian track or the Palestinian track. For the past 14 months, when we started negotiating under the mandate of the Rabin government, there was a subtle competition between the Syrian track and the Palestinian track as to who would be first. The initial policy of the Rabin government was to move ahead on the Palestinian track. If you remember the statements by candidate Rabin and then by Prime Minister Rabin in his first days in power, he spoke about coming to an autonomy agreement with the Palestinians within 6 to 9 months of holding elections and so forth, and speaking mostly about the difficulties of coming to an agreement with Syria. And this was the initial policy. But within weeks, the government discovered that it was difficult to move ahead with the Palestinians, that the delegation coming to Washington did not have real authority. The Palestinian delegation did not have real authority, that on the other hand, the negotiations with Syria proceeded much better than we had expected. And therefore, for almost a year, from about September 1992 to late July 1993, the current assumption was that it would be a Syria first and not a Palestinian first policy, in the sense that this would be the first breakthrough in the peace process. Now, this did not happen because of several difficulties inherent in the Syrian negotiations. I'll mention them briefly. One was that President Assad of Syria, who conducts the negotiations personally under very close personal scrutiny, wants to obtain what Sadat had obtained, but is not willing to offer what Sadat had offered, both in terms of substance and in terms of procedure. He insists that he wants the whole Golan Heights, but he's not willing to give us the full peace and the very impressive security arrangements that President Sadat ended up giving Israel in the negotiations of the late 1970s. In terms of procedure, he's not willing to open parallel channels, even after the Oslo channel demonstrated how useful such channels can be. And he's not willing to engage in public diplomacy. Public diplomacy in this context means that we would like both parties, in this case Syria and Israel, to demonstrate publicly to one another that they are shifting their positions, that Syria is determined to move from opposition to Israel to peacemaking with Israel, and that Israel will demonstrate to the Syrian public in turn that Israel is willing to accommodate a considerable portion of Syria's demands. And in this way, we feel that support for the agreement can be built it is particularly important to us in the context of moving a democratic polity from a position of opposition to major concessions to Syria to the position in which such concessions could be made as part and parcel of genuine peacemaking. We feel that this is a very important part of the negotiating process in this context, but President Assad does not share this view. That is one major difficulty in these negotiations. Secondly, there are genuine difficulties in negotiations between an autocratic system and a democratic system. And 13 months of negotiations have provided me with ample proof of this difficulty. Let's take one interesting example, the role of the media. Some of you may have watched President Assad on McNeil Lehrer last week. He was asked about the performance of the Palestinian opposition groups in Damascus. And he said, why should I clamp down on Palestinian rejectionists? Does Mr. Rabin clamp down on the Likud opposition in Israel? Now, let's put it this way, the Syrian political system and the Israeli political system are quite different. Any comparison of the functioning of the opposition in our parliamentary system and the functioning of rejectionist Palestinian groups in Damascus is, of course, quite preposterous, but this can be a formalistic position maintained by Syria, or it can be a reflection of a genuine inability to understand how a democratic polity operates. And as we have negotiated more freely during the past year, and we have commented on each other's media and public pronouncements by the leaders, we have sensed that there is this genuine difficulty for Syrians to understand how a system works, and sometimes for us, I shall confess, a genuine difficulty in appreciating the difficulties that negotiators who work in the service of a less than free society have in negotiating with us. So that is a second difficulty. A third and very important difficulty is that we are not just negotiating with Syria, or Syria is not just negotiating with us. Syria is conducting two parallel negotiations here, and we are not necessarily the more important one. And the other negotiation, perhaps the more important negotiation, is with the United States. Syria has lost the Soviet patron. It wants to move towards the American orbit. It wants to build up a relationship with the United States. It wants to be a partner of the United States in the Middle East, and not the least of partners. And it sees the peace process with Israel and negotiations with Israel as very much a function of these other negotiations. Now, it so happened that between late September and August, there was not a great deal of progress between the United States and Syria. Syria worked out a fairly close relationship with the Bush administration. They were partners in the coalition against Saddam. But as we came into the negotiations in August and began to negotiate seriously in September, President Bush was beginning to lose grounds and to fade as a candidate in the incoming elections, and Assad had to ponder the value of dealing with Bush. And then Bush lost on November 4th, and then Clinton became the winner and eventually the incumbent. And it took several more months before a working relationship was worked out between Syria and the Clinton administration. More or less in early August, when Secretary Christopher made his second trip to the Middle East, a meaningful dialogue began between the administration and Syria. But by the time it began to yield the first fruits, Yasser Arafat had moved earlier, quicker, and was the first to come to closure, and Assad ended out being outdistanced. Let me put it this way. So these are the difficulties, and the result is that we now have a new phase in the Israeli-Syrian negotiations, one in which there is an Israeli-Palestinian agreement. Now, what does it mean for the Syrian negotiations? There are two positive aspects. One is that the Syrians no longer have to worry about the Palestinians. One stumbling block in these negotiations was the fact that the Syrians kept dealing with us not only as on a bilateral level, but tended to portray themselves as the defenders of the Palestinian cause. But they no longer have to do it. The Palestinians went ahead and took care of their own needs. Secondly, we demonstrated, or Prime Minister Rabin demonstrated to President Assad that he is serious. He made one deal, and he made it work. And in negotiations, you always, as in any other form of business, you always want to be certain that your counterpart wants to deliver and can deliver. So Assad now knows that Rabin can deliver. But he asked himself other questions too. Can he deliver now on Syria, or does he have to wait? We've indicated to Syria that we want to continue seriously with them, and we expect all the questions that have not been answered in the past to be answered now, but that we also need some time, because this Palestinian agreement, the deal, needs to be digested by the Israeli public and political system. We need to show the first political dividends to our public, and then we can move ahead with the next large chunk of the peace process. Some spacing needs to happen, and Syria may find it less than comfortable. They also realize that their maneuvering space has been limited by the fact that the Palestinians went ahead and made their own deal. So President Assad is not very happy with the Palestinian deal. He's not fighting it openly, but he exudes a sense of dissatisfaction and discomfort with this deal. So this is where we stand with regard to the Syrians. Two other partners to the negotiations. Lebanon, unfortunately, totally depends on Syria, and the negotiations with Lebanon totally depend on what happens in the negotiations with Syria, and so I'm afraid we'll have to wait for progress with Syria before we can seriously contemplate progress with Lebanon. With Jordan, it's different. King Hussein and the other members of the Jordanian elite were not enamored of the September 13 agreement. They know that the fate of the Hashemite monarchy depends very closely on whatever happens in Palestinian politics. They were not interested in an achievement to the PLO and in the prospect of a Palestinian entity emerging. But they cannot afford to sulk. They need to operate because of the urgency of the issue, and therefore they have responded and they have engaged. They signed a peace agenda with us. They moved again on Friday. And we would like to think that this indicates that we are going to move ahead along dual lines, both with the Palestinians and with the Jordanians. We think that certainly in economic terms and possibly also in political terms, the issue cannot be separated, and we think that it would be a blessing if the Jordanians remain engaged in the same fashion. Technically, we will continue to negotiate in Washington. We are interested, like others, in keeping the Madrid formula and framework. And by the end of October, we expect the 12th round of negotiations to take place in Washington with the Syrians, Jordanians, and the Lebanese, and with the Palestinians. We envisage more than one track of negotiations with the Palestinians, which should come as no surprise. Washington talks, in which we'll discuss elections, the council, and other issues, but closer to the area itself. We have suggested two locations in Egypt, Taba and El Arish. And El Arish, we would like to meet with the Palestinians and have experts meet and discuss the question of Gaza first and Jericho first, and because these are questions in which meticulous detail needs to be addressed. A large number of experts will be coming, and there's no point in sending dozens of experts to Washington when they can reach a more comfortable destination by car. So this is the recipe for the next few weeks and months. A round of talks a la Madrid in late October, early November. Trips by the U.S. peace team and every so often by the Secretary of State to the region in between rounds. Continued Israeli-Palestinian negotiations, not just in Washington, but in other places as well. Our priority is to first implement the Palestinian agreements 3 weeks have passed since September 13 and much has not happened, and we've reminded our Palestinian interlocutors that October 13 is around the corner. On October 13, we should start the negotiations for the Gaza and Jericho first, and we have 2 months to complete them. This is not a lot of time. Last Friday, a very impressive gathering was held in Washington. $600 million were mobilized for the West Bank and Gaza and for regional projects related to them for next year. There has to be a Palestinian mechanism in place in order to absorb that money, in order to use it well. It is still not in place, and time is of the essence. And this is our first priority, to implement these agreements and to turn them into a success story. Secondly, we want to persuade the Syrians that we remain very seriously engaged and committed in our negotiations with them, and that we want to proceed with them and bring the negotiations to conclusion. Thirdly, we would like to expand, as I said earlier, the process of normalization, reconciliation between Israel and large parts of the Arab world and of the Islamic world that have yet to recognize us, both for its own value and in order to send home to our public the sense that the risk involved in making the September 13 agreement was worth its while. This is a rich agenda for the next few months. Very much hope that in a few months' time there'll be other agreements, other exploits, other concrete manifestations of agreement, and that if the Kennedy School invites me to come again, I would be here in a position to analyze how the next breakthrough, the second breakthrough in the peace process, has occurred. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. Ambassador Rabinovich has agreed to take some questions. We're on a very tight schedule this evening. We have about 20 minutes, so I would ask people please to keep their questions brief, to identify themselves and make sure that they're questions. At the end, we have microphone here, and I guess microphones there and there. So why don't we start right here, if you would identify yourself and ask
Good
your
evening,
question.
Ambassador. My name is Melissa Liazes. I'm a member of the Student Advisory Committee here at the Institute of Politics. First off, I'd like to thank you for speaking this evening. I think I'm speaking on behalf of everyone when I say that. My question deals with your third point. I think that the September 13th agreements are definitely a huge step forward in terms of Israeli-Palestinian relations, but as you noted, it only deals with the Palestinians. Do you see Israel reaching substantially similar agreements with other groups, such as the Syrians, Jordanians, Lebanese, or do you see significant differences? And if there are differences, do you feel that that could create more tension in that other groups may feel that they have not gotten as good a deal?
Okay. The answer is yes. Now, let me elaborate on the yes. It's actually easy to reach Israeli, Lebanese, and Israeli-Jordanian agreements. There is no real bone of contention between us and Lebanon. We are in the security zone in South Lebanon. We have announced that we have no territorial claims or ambitions in Lebanon, and that once we are persuaded that Lebanon has established its authority, real authority in South Lebanon, control the area, take away terrorist groups, and guarantee the security, safety of our northern border, we are willing to leave. Unlike in previous years, we are not linking it to a departure of the Syrian army from Lebanon. And therefore, if the Lebanese were allowed to proceed on their own, I trust that very swiftly we could have had the Lebanese-Israeli peace agreement. Likewise with Jordan, the bilateral issues between us and Jordan are fairly easy and simple. We have signed on September 14th an agenda for peacemaking with Jordan, and if not linked to Syria or to the Palestinian issue, we and the Jordanians could have sorted out a peace agreement fairly soon. We also have a long tradition of, say, relations with the Jordanian elite. Finally, we had an open meeting with the Crown Prince, but our elites have been communicating quite effectively for over 20 years now, and left alone, we and the Jordanians could come to an agreement fairly soon. So these are the two easy parts of the triangle. Syria is more difficult. Syria, because there is a major territorial issue between us and Syria, namely the Golan Heights, and there is the question of what Syria is willing to offer. We know very clearly what Syria demands. Syria demands the Golan Heights. But we have yet to find out what Syria is offering us. Now, there is an asymmetry between peace and withdrawal. Withdrawal is very clear. We all know what withdrawal from the Golan Heights means. But what does peace mean? What does full peace mean? It's an interesting development, because 3 years ago, to have heard a Syrian spokesman say, "We'll give you full peace," would have been wonderful. But now that we are in serious negotiations, we discovered that this doesn't tell us all that much. Does full peace signify diplomatic relations, trade relations, open borders, airline flights, or does it not? We don't know. We need to hear from the Syrians whether it does. Secondly, security. As I put it in the negotiations to the Syrians, we have no biblical claims on the Golan Heights. For us, it is a security issue. But before we make concessions in the Golan Heights, we need to know what Syria has in mind in terms of security arrangement. Is it willing to do what Egypt did in the Sinai, or does it have a stingier notion of security arrangements? When we have satisfactory responses to these questions, we'll know whether we can move ahead with Syria in the same way.
Yes.
Good evening, Ambassador Rabinovich. My name is Zishan Saidi. I'm also a member of the Student Advisory Committee here at the Institute of Politics at the Kennedy School. Welcome on our behalf again. And my question has to do with an issue that's been sort of tossed into the back burner, metaphorically speaking, and that's the question of Jerusalem, or Al-Quds al-Sharif, a city that, as you know, is both historic and sacred for both parties involved. And it is without question that the city is dear to the hearts of the Palestinians. As you recall, when the PLO declared an independent state, a nominal independent state in the late 80s, they declared Jerusalem as the capital, even though they have little or no administration run out of Jerusalem. And on the other hand, although there are standing resolutions at the UN calling for Israel to withdraw from East Jerusalem, that's not about to happen. So what do you foresee happening with regards to this issue, in which there seems to be no possible compromise?
One of the advantages of the September 13 agreement being an interim agreement is that it enables us to circumvent issues that are not soluble now. Final status, settlements, Jerusalem is not the only issue that has been addressed but not resolved now. And that's the whole point about making an interim agreement. That is to say, you define a period of 5 years in which a new relationship can hopefully be developed between the two parties, in which confidence can be built, and in which something that seems intractable now could become manageable 3, 4, 5 years down the road. If you look at the concessions that the Palestinians made in this agreement, there were some that we made, like accepting the PLO and dealing with the PLO, and concessions that the other party made. Jerusalem was one of them. Arafat, by agreeing to shelve the Jerusalem issue for 2 years and to start dealing with it only in the 3rd year in the final status negotiations, made a concession that enabled us to accept, made it more palatable to the Israeli side. And therefore, I have no ready-made answer for you. I don't know what the situation will be 3 or 4 years from now, but the point I will be making is that it's in the interest of both sides to make it work so that what now seems to be unacceptable in terms of Jerusalem becomes acceptable when the parties discover that they can live together. By the way, you said Jerusalem is sacred to both parties. It's sacred even to more. I mean, there's a Christian dimension to this that is not represented in the negotiations, of which we are also acutely aware. Thank you.
Yes, sure.
Hello, my name is Youssef Hashimi, I'm MPP2 at the Kennedy School. Shalom v'chag sameach, Ambassador. My question has to do with the economic dividends and realizing the full potential of this, both among the Palestinians and particularly in Israel. You spoke towards the end of your speech about the necessity for the development of an infrastructure to absorb an influx of funds to help along Palestinian development. My question, though, deals with the necessity for change within Israel and its economic structure, moving away from a command centralized economy more towards a market economy to realize the full dividends of peace, and how that is a necessary aspect of this whole peace process to realize its full potential.
Is Dr. Zussman permanently here this year? Because right in front of me is one of the leading economists in Israel, and I hesitate to pronounce on a subject on which he knows so much and I know so little. But let me say two things. One is that there has to, I spoke briefly about the economic side of this peacemaking, but it's a very important dimension of the whole process, and particularly so in the Israeli-Palestinian-Jordanian context. Israeli-Syrian agreement or the Israeli-Lebanese agreement will be essentially political. There is not a great economic motivation in the Syrian-Israeli relationship or Lebanese-Israeli relationship. But when it comes to the relationship between Israel, Jordan, and the Palestinians, the economic dimension is very, very important. And there has to be a considerable uplift in the standard of living to make all of this attractive. And there has to be a rehabilitation process. The rehabilitation can only take place within a regional process. We look at such projects as the canal leading from the Mediterranean to the Dead Sea, generating power, generating employment. We look at the project of another canal, a smaller canal, from the Red Sea inland that would enable both the Jordanians and us to replace the Aqaba port and the port of Eilat with an inland port in that canal that we could share. And I could go on and on in demonstrating why in this particular context economic projects make a lot of sense, but as you know very well, the Kennedy School is also houses this is no pun intended, houses the Haussmann project, and much of what we know about all of this has happened here. Now, in Israel itself, we have been liberalizing at a slower pace than anticipated, but after 14 months of the Rabin government, when you look at some privatization and some other developments, we perhaps had less progress than we wanted, but we are marching on the way to privatization and liberalization that I philosophically fully endorse, and I think would be to the good of Israel, and given the economic dimension of the peace process, then for the peace process as well.
Hi, I'm Suzanne Nassau. I'm studying dispute resolution at the law school. I have a question that comes a little bit more from a process standpoint, which is, what part did the nearly 2 years of the Madrid process play in setting the stage for the breakthrough that was achieved last month? A lot of people seem to feel that process achieved no success, and I'm wondering what part you felt it played in leading to the move forward.
I saw earlier Dr. Hirschfeld. Is he here with us? He was at dinner, but anyway, who was one of the initiators of the Oslo channel, and I suppose that in years to come, many hairs will be split over the question of who did more for breakthrough. But the two were indispensable, and much happened in Washington that made the breakthrough in Oslo possible. And let me give just two illustrations. One is the very question of Jerusalem that was raised earlier. Yasser Arafat very astutely used the Jerusalem issue in order to legislate his Washington negotiator out of the game. He told them, you insist on Jerusalem, and you tell them in Washington that without progress on Jerusalem, you cannot move. So that stuck the negotiation in Washington. Then he could make the big concession in Oslo on Jerusalem. So he used the Washington channel in order to create some maneuverability for himself in Oslo. Then some of the language that was used in Oslo has actually been crafted in the context of the Washington negotiations. For instance, you find the language of jurisdiction or single territorial unit in the Declaration of Principles that was signed in Oslo. These were all worked out in Washington. So both in terms of the attrition that must happen in negotiations in order to produce the alternative channel, and in terms of the substantive work, some very important work was done in Washington.
Good evening, Ambassador. My name is Beth Brundage. I'm a graduate student at Boston University, and I'm curious more about the role of Syria and whether the image of Syria as a regional powerhouse that can derail the peace process is now an obsolete image, and whether who in the area has that ability to derail the peace process, if anyone. Is it Iran? What role could Syria and Iran play? What type of spoiler role could they play?
Clearly, this is something we can speculate on, but the proof of that pudding will only be in the eating that I hope we will not witness. But I think when you have parties who are determined to proceed in peacemaking, then troublemakers, derailers, are limited in what they can accomplish. And let me bring an example from the Israeli-Egyptian negotiations. And Egypt was totally isolated in the Arab world and was banned from the Arab League. And at the height of the negotiations in '78, a major challenge to the peace through what we call the coastal highway attack was staged by Palestinian groups from South Lebanon. Israel responded in the major Litani operation that created the security zone that I mentioned earlier. It was a fairly massive operation, and the peace negotiations with Egypt survived because there was a stake. There were two partners coherent and determined to proceed, and they did. The problem with the Israeli-Palestinian agreement is that it is fragile and precarious as it is. The Palestinians are not a state, they are a society, a community. They don't have a coherent political structure. The agreement is very complex, and therefore regional powers like Syria or like Iran could potentially muster enough energy in order to derail a process that is precarious and fragile in its own right. Now, there's nothing much we can do about Iran. We'll not placate Iran. We'll just have to isolate and limit Iran's influence and ability to project from the northeast and through Lebanon into the core of the region. But Syria is close, and Syria has enough mischief-making potentially in Lebanon, in Palestinian politics, directly so, in general Arab politics, that it would be better to prevent Syria from feeling that it wants to throw its weight about. Now, since that happens to be our interest anyway, I mean, since, as I said earlier, we are determined to move ahead with Syria, and we do want to make peace with Syria, there's no point in making an agreement with the Palestinians and potentially with somebody else and leaving an open wound with Syria. We do want to terminate that conflict, and therefore this calculus tallies very well with the previous calculus, and I hope very much that this would remain a very theoretical discussion.
Yes.
Once again, thank you and good evening, Mr. Ambassador. My name is Jarrett Blanc. I'm a freshman here, and my question relates to the type of peace that is being envisioned. This is not a peace of deterrence, as Mr. Netanyahu would call it. And what I'm wondering is, if the current coalition in the Israeli parliament should fall, do you fear that the peace itself will not be stable? Because as this really is a peace of trust and not deterrence, would another party or another coalition be able to maintain it and further it in the next 3 or 4 years?
This is also highly theoretical. I mean, this now, if I think the vote in the Knesset, and more importantly, the change of line and tune that we have been hearing from the opposition in recent days, indicate that the opposition leadership reads the public mood in Israel as very supportive of the agreement. There was talk coming from the Israeli opposition in earlier weeks that should there be a change of government in the next elections or at some other date, then the new government must not respect the agreement. I think that this is a wrong rhetoric for an opposition for two reasons. One is that I think it runs against the grain of a democratic system. The whole point of a democracy is that there is, or not the whole point, but one of the points about dealing with democracy is that there is continuity from one government to the next. And the same people who were making that argument were telling us that there's no point in making peace with Arab dictatorships because there is no continuity. So we cannot belie this by suggesting that there will not be continuity in our case. Domestically, it's a dangerous argument. It really cuts against the grain of a democratic system at work. And also, it creates anxiety on the part of other Arabs when we are looking at agreements that we want to build over time. One of the ways of reconciling the Syrian and Israeli positions is to spread the agreement over time. But if the opposition says publicly that it may not want to respect agreements made several years down the road, why should Syria agree to an agreement that is going to be implemented gradually in phases over time? There's a third argument against this line. But as I said earlier, these are voices from an earlier phase. What we hear from the Israeli opposition in recent days is that the agreement is a done deal. Let's adapt to this reality and let's try and affect the course of events within the agreement and not try to derail the agreement. I think that's a much more encouraging music to hear.
Good evening, Ambassador. Welcome. Thank you for coming. My name is Emily Fleschner. I'm a first-year student. And my question is how tolerant Israel will be of violence by Hamas and or other groups.
Well, the brevity of my response hardly warrants getting up from the chair, but it will not be tolerant at all. I mean, we have demonstrated in recent days in the continued activity, particularly in the Gaza Strip, that we are as vigilant as we have been, and this is done both for its own sake, but also as a message that this is not something that will be tolerant at all towards.
I'm afraid the time has come. One of the advantages of being dean of this school is you get to host events like this. One of the disadvantages is that you have to call them to an end in order not to terminate warm U.S.-Israel relationships by not getting the ambassador back in time for the last plane to Washington. To show you how he has made the transition from being an academic to being a statesman, something which he has been for some time, there were those who asked for a copy of his speech tonight. The notes were written on a sheet of paper just smaller than a 3x5 card, which says something about not only the eloquence, but the candor as well. So we very much appreciate your being with us. Thank you so much.